Shannon.
Laura, thank you so much, and a great remembrance we all need to take note of today. We begin our show with a Fox News alert. The long-awaited Justice Department Inspector General's final report on his probe into the FBI's handling of the Hillary Clinton email case is expected any time now. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has new information on that front tonight. Plus, the president hosts his very first iftar meal, marking the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. General Jerry Boykin explains what's behind the White House's decision. And a bombshell report from Congress tonight saying the Obama administration intentionally misled the American people and Congress by trying to give Iran access to our financial system while publicly saying it wouldn't happen. That senator behind the report is here tonight. Hello and welcome to Fox News at Night. I'm Shannon Bream in Washington. Tonight, the recently fired #2 at the FBI, Andrew McCabe, is seeking immunity for himself in exchange for telling Congress what he knows about Hillary Clinton's emails in that investigation. And the former head of the Bureau, James Comey, according to a new report, is going to be under fire for how he did his job. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has more on these developments. Good evening, Catherine.
Shannon, the report puts Director Comey's leadership style under the microscope, with the Inspector General exploring whether Comey went beyond his authorities in July 2016, when he publicly discussed the Clinton email case and recommended against criminal charges, a responsibility that fell to his boss at the time, Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Comey has since explained that Lynch's Arizona tarmac meeting with Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton's FBI interview for mishandling classified information, was a game changer, in addition to other intelligence that implied Lynch would not let the email case go too far. The intelligence is not public, and its reliability is still unclear. On Fox, the former director seemed to choose his words carefully about Lynch.
I think we're both telling the truth. I never went to her and said, Loretta, I think you should recuse yourself. My problem was she had already announced it publicly that she wouldn't and that she would accept my recommendation. And so at that point, what do I do? And I decided at that point I got to step away from her.
In a separate development, Fox News confirms that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who worked directly under Comey, wants a special status if he testifies on Capitol Hill. It's called use immunity, and it means testimony cannot be used against him in a criminal prosecution. The Inspector General found that McCabe lied under oath and made a criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney here in Washington, D.C. for lying to federal investigators. This morning, a senior Senate Republican on the Judiciary Committee recommended against a deal to secure McCabe's testimony.
We really need to get to the bottom of what happened at the FBI during the Comey years, where apparently there was misconduct going on, which I think has really impugned the reputation of the finest law enforcement agency in the world. And we need to clear the air. And so I think giving Mr. McCabe cover through immunity would be a mistake.
McCabe's lawyer said, quote, McCabe is willing to testify, but because of the criminal referral, he must be afforded suitable legal protection, adding that if he were unable to get such a deal, McCabe will have no choice but to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. Testimony is scheduled for Monday before the Senate Judiciary Committee. That committee has the lead on the report, but that date could slide yet again. Shannon?
All right, Catherine Herridge, thank you very much. And still, we wait for the Justice Department Inspector General's report on his probe into the FBI's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. The president on Twitter yesterday slamming the, quote, numerous delays. Lawmakers now questioning whether or not that report is being watered down.
I share the president's concern that the actual substance of the report has likely been written for some time. Now you may have people trying to sand off the rough edges and make it look like the conduct was more acceptable than it should have been. So the president expressed that concern in his tweet yesterday. Based on some of my own sources, I share that concern.
All right, let's bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree for analysis. Tom, always great to have you with us.
Thank you, Shannon.
What do you make of this? I mean, Congressman Gates there saying it's as if they could be sanding off the edges. We know a number of people get to review the draft. What do you think happens in the process?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I am a little worried about what's going on. It has taken a long time. I mean, normally a Department of Justice Inspector General's report is not something that the American public is hungering for and doesn't fly off the shelves. This obviously has captivated the nation's interest. People want to know what the Inspector General found, and the fact that there has been a suspiciously long delay in getting it out the door makes you wonder what's going on. Typically, when bureaucrats in Washington are editing and reviewing, it's not to make something more transparent. deterrent.
No.
It often has the reverse effect. So I'm hopeful that they will get this out within a week. They'll let the Inspector General render his findings and then let the debate begin.
Well, and what we're hearing, and a little bit of leaking here and there, is that FBI Director Comey, then Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and McCabe may all be in for some serious criticism. And now they wait, as we do the rest of the world, to see what exactly they're going to be subjected to.
Absolutely. And look, this Inspector General, I think when we first began this endeavor several months ago, people said, who is the Inspector General? What is he? Is he really independent? And I think he showed through his report on McCabe that he's not someone who pulls his punches. He's someone who gets to the facts, who tells it like it is. And so I think everyone is looking forward with great anticipation to what he's found. We've heard all sorts of rumors. Maybe there is misconduct by very senior officials. And I think that we're all going to be paying very close attention to what he finds in his report, which I expect will be thorough and exhaustive.
All right. So former FBI Director James Comey was asked in this case by Senator Dick Blumenthal, a Democrat, about whether or not he was under inspection or investigation. Now, here's what he said about that.
The Inspector General is inspecting me and looking at my conduct in the course of the email investigation, which I know this sounds like a crazy thing to say. I want that inspection because I want my story told because some of it's classified. But also, if I did something wrong, I want to hear that. I don't think I did. But yeah, I've been interviewed, and I'm sure I'll be interviewed again.
You think he's going to want to hear that? Or Ms. Lynch or Mr. McCabe? Do you think they're looking forward to the results?
Things may have changed. I can't imagine that any of those three are anxiously or at least looking forward with optimism and hope to what the Inspector General has found. I mean, we've heard enough through leaks and other sources to know that those people have jeopardy. I mean, McCabe already has shown that he has jeopardy for what he did when he was at the Bureau.
Okay, so he is now facing, the U.S. Attorney is considering whether or not to pursue criminal charges against him. So he's got that. In the meantime, he's now asked for immunity from the Senate Judiciary Committee because they want him to testify. He says, I will, but I'm going to need some protection because of these potential criminal charges. Here's what our own Judge Napolitano had to say about that.
So I have to tell you, unheard of for the number 2 person in the FBI saying, you want me to testify? Give me immunity. And quite frankly, this is not the way you get immunity, by writing a public letter.
So how unusual is this? How would immunity work?
Well, it's exceedingly unusual for a high-level official like this to seek immunity or even to plead the Fifth. I think from McCabe's perspective, look, he already is the subject of a criminal referral from the Inspector General. We know for a fact that he is under federal criminal investigation by the U.S. Attorney here in D.C., who's already interviewed James Comey, who apparently has said very disparaging things about McCabe. So while I agree with the judge that this is unusual and you never want to see high-level government officials, seeking immunity, taking the Fifth, things like that, I got to say, if I were his lawyers, I can't say it's the craziest decision. I think he knows he has serious potential exposure here, and why put your client out there when he could just create evidence that could be used against him in a prosecution?
Yeah, we always say talk less.
Yes.
Don't do anything you don't have to do. Don't offer up anything.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned Comey and McCabe. I mean, they've publicly been praised. They've had praise for each other, but we know privately they've disagreed. In the earlier Inspector General report, they didn't agree on who was telling the truth about leaks to the media, for sure. So do these two potentially turn on each other behind closed doors and in the midst of all these investigations?
I think that's a real possibility, Shannon. I mean, what has been so striking to me is that even though Comey and McCabe were number 1 and 2, he was the deputy, they are already at cross purposes. We have already heard from Comey that he was very disappointed in what McCabe did. I'm sure there's no love return from McCabe to Comey at this point. And I expect as this whole process moves forward, we are going to see greater ruptures between the two as those two allies now start to turn on one another.
Well, as you said, it's not like we all sit around with popcorn waiting for the Inspector General report normally, but
this time we will. We will.
All right, we'll have you back.
All right.
You know we're getting it soon. All right, Tom,
Perfect.
thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Shannon.
All right, the historic summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Trump just days away. Fox News at Night is going to have extended special coverage on Monday night. You know, it's daytime over there, so we'll be here extra hours for you. But as the U.S. prepares to take the lead in diplomacy towards denuclearizing the Korean peninsula, it appears some other world leaders may be trying to get their hands on the results of the summit. Kristen Fisher is tracking that tonight. She's got more and new developments in Iran raising alarms within the State Department. Good evening, Kristen.
Hey, Shannon. Well, Iran is threatening to do exactly what many people feared that it would do in the aftermath of the U.S. pulling out of the Iran deal, and that is restarting uranium enrichment and ignoring UN nuclear inspectors. First, Iran's supreme leader said his country will probably start producing centrifuges, which are used for uranium enrichment, if the deal collapses. And then today, Iran informed the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, that it would not cooperate more fully with investigators until the fate of the deal is resolved. Well, just a few hours ago, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, responded to all of these developments on Twitter by saying, quote, "We're watching reports that Iran plans to increase its enrichment capacity. We won't allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran is aware of our resolve. It's another example of Iran foolishly squandering its resources." Now, the U.S. is, of course, out of the deal. But remember, France, Britain, and Germany are all still in. And this week, officials from those countries asked the U.S. for an exemption from sanctions. Billions of dollars of EU investments in Iran are at stake. But so far, Shannon, the Trump administration hasn't budged.
All right, Kristen, so now back to the Singapore summit. Who are all of these potential summit crashers, as folks are starting to call them?
Shannon, it's pretty wild. Everyone from South Korea's president to, wait for it, Dennis Rodman. And then there's also shaping up to be several mini summits, both before and after the big Singapore summit. The latest development is that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is now reported to be planning a visit to Pyongyang. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin just sent his top envoy to North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-un in person and invite him to visit Russia sometime soon. Then you have Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who's racing halfway around the world later this week to come to the White House and give President Trump his last-minute advice. And finally, there's basketball player Dennis Rodman. Now, Rodman, he's an old friend of Kim Jong-un. Remember that basketball diplomacy? He's visited North Korea 5 times, but he was also a contestant on Celebrity Apprentice. So he has the unique distinction of being one of the very few people on the planet who knows both Kim Jong-un and President Trump. Now, Rodman wants to be in Singapore for this summit. His agent told the Washington Post tonight that he wants to be there for, quote-unquote, moral support. Shannon, I tell you, you just can't make this stuff up.
It's all these different worlds colliding, and it's
really
almost like you couldn't have scripted it. All right, Kristen Fisher, thank you very much.
Thanks.
A report released by Senate Republicans today says the Obama administration deliberately misled the public and Congress by granting a license which would have allowed Iran to access the financial system right here in the U.S. by sidestepping sanctions. Former Obama officials say it was all part of the spirit of the Iran nuclear deal, part of the benefits they promised to Iran. Well, Chairman of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, Senator Rob Portman, joins us now to discuss this report that's caught a lot of people by surprise. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So what exactly was going on here? What did you uncover?
Well, we spent 2 years looking at this because we heard rumors that there was some sort of a sanctions violation by the administration, that they had allowed Iran to have access to our financial system. We just did a lot of interviews and talked to a lot of people, and were able to get emails that others had not received. And it became very clear that what happened is that the administration chose to mislead Congress and mislead the American people by saying they're not getting access to the U.S. banks, to the U.S. dollar, to the U.S. financial system, when in fact they granted them a specific license to do so.
We want to play a little bit of what 2 top Treasury officials, including then Secretary of the Treasury Jack Lew, had to say publicly about this.
With very limited exceptions, Iran will continue to be denied access to the world's largest market, and we will maintain powerful sanctions targeting Iran's support for terrorist groups.
Iran will be denied access to the world's most important market and unable to deal in the world's most important currency.
Okay, so that was back in 2015, shortly after the deal had come together. But what you later found is in the spring of 2016, this administration, the previous administration, actually granted a license which would have allowed them to do what they needed to do, which was get the currency translated into something that they could then spend. And they were angry with the administration, or frustrated that they didn't think they were getting what they had agreed to under the deal.
They had $5.8 billion that was in a bank in Oman called the Bank of Muscat. And they wanted to convert that into euros ultimately through dollars. Since they had a dollar-denominated currency, it was better to do through dollars. And so they asked the Treasury Department if they could get the ability to do that. And sure enough, the Treasury Department granted them a license to do it. Now, what's interesting is they went to the 2 big U.S. banks that would be the appropriate banks to do this. Both banks said, no, we want nothing to do with this. This is wrong. In other words, the reputational risk and the legal risk was too high. So ultimately, the dollars were not provided to be able to convert that currency. And over time, they converted it to euros, as we understand it, in small amounts in Europe, much less efficiently. But the point is, at that time, the administration was saying, we're not allowing the U.S. financial system to be used. We're not allowing the dollar to be used. We're keeping all of our sanctions in place. Only the secondary sanctions on others are we allowing the Iranians to have access to, when in fact they were granting this license. So it's just wrong. And Look, it's important that we flesh that out, because now, with regard to the next Iran agreement, or with regard to our agreement with North Korea or others, we're going to require more transparency, I hope, and that's part of our recommendations.
Some response to the report today. Ned Price, who of course was part of the Obama administration, says this: they continue to malign the deal in an effort to justify President Trump's unjustifiable decision. Sounds like he's referring there to the fact that President Trump has withdrawn from this deal. But they say this is about besmirching the deal and nothing more.
This investigation is 2 years old. It began long before we knew President Trump would be president, much less that he would pull out of the Iran agreement. But it was done, in a totally straight-up objective way. And, we found that this had occurred, and I think it's important the American people know about it. And that, again, for the future, we have better transparency. Anytime there's this kind of a special license granted, we ought to know about it. Congress ought to know. The American people ought to know. In this case, it was kept from us, I think because, as you said earlier, Iran was frustrated. They were angry. We know this from public documents as well as private documents now. And I think they wanted to be sure Iran would stay with the agreement. And so they were willing to do something that, was counter not just to what they said they were going to do, but counter to the approach here, which was that U.S. sanctions would stay in place.
Is there any legal liability here? What does it say to you more broadly about the previous administration's desire to get and lock in and keep this deal in place?
Well, it says that they were willing to do things that they shouldn't do in order to both get the Iranians to the table and then keep them at the table and hold the agreement. And look, there was a vote in the United States Senate. People forget about this sometimes. The vote was a majority Republican and Democrat vote against the Iran agreement. It wasn't the necessary 2/3, which we had to have had under the rules, but it was a vote against it. Normally, if you have a treaty, of course, you have to have a 2/3 vote in order to approve it. The administration knew they couldn't get that, so they did not seek this to be a treaty. But then when there was a vote on this issue in Congress, sure enough, a majority of the United States Congress said this is not a good agreement. And I think that's one reason the president chose, because he was able to, without it being a treaty, to pull back and to say, let's put together something that makes more sense.
Well, I know that it's been a long process. It certainly flew under our radar. We had no idea this was in process, but I know that Democrats also worked with you on this. They ultimately chose not to sign the final product, but so folks know they were part of the investigation. Senator Portman, thank you. It's very interesting.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you again.
Well, the president hosting his first dinner commemorating the close of Ramadan. But while the White House celebrates and faces heated criticism, could the dinner be a message for our allies abroad? Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin joins us live with his take. An extraordinary scene at the White House just a short while ago. It was a first for the Trump presidency. The president tonight hosting his first iftar dinner at the White House in honor of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. Critics say it's all for show, but what exactly is the president's strategy? Well, Garrett Tenney is tracking the dinner. He's here to explain what this outreach to Islam is all about. For President, as we remind folks, his first trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia. Garrett?
Yeah, Shannon, and on that trip to the heart of the Muslim world, President Trump said he chose to meet with the leaders of more than 50 Muslim-majority countries so he could deliver a message of friendship and hope. A few weeks later, though, the White House announced that for the first time in nearly 20 years, it would not be hosting an iftar dinner during Ramadan. Instead, the president released a Ramadan message that talked about rejecting violence and fighting terrorism. Now, that offended a lot of folks in the Muslim community who were still outraged over the president's so-called Muslim travel ban and the rhetoric that he used to defend it.
I think Islam hates us. There's something there that there's a tremendous hatred there. There's a tremendous hatred. We have to get to the bottom of it. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. When it comes to radical Islamic terrorism, ignorance is not bliss. It's deadly, totally deadly.
This year, the president's Ramadan message had a much different tone, noting the richness Muslims add to the religious tapestry of American life. That was not enough for many Muslim organizations, though, who balked at the president's plans to host a dinner for Ramadan this year and said they would not attend even if they were invited. Groups like CARE and others even organized a protest across the street from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue tonight, saying in their event Description: President Trump has attacked Muslims since the beginning of his campaign and codified his Islamophobia with the Muslim bans. Now he wants to make nice and host an iftar dinner after skipping the tradition last year. However, one of the nation's oldest Muslim organizations disagrees with that strategy, and a spokesman for Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA tells Fox News Muslim Americans should rise above bitterness against Trump and exercise this opportunity to communicate clearly what our vision is for a better America and a better world. That is what Ramadan is all about. The ambassadors from more than a dozen Muslim nations did attend tonight's dinner at the White House, where President Trump thanked them for their friendship and cooperation.
In gathering together this evening, we honor a sacred tradition of one of the world's great religions. Iftars mark the coming together of families and friends to celebrate a timeless message of peace, clarity, and love. There is great love.
The White House has not said why it decided to host a dinner for Ramadan this year, and it didn't release a list of who was attending tonight. But the fact that no major Muslim groups were invited and that it appeared to be mostly ambassadors is why a number of analysts are suggesting this dinner wasn't about reaching out to American Muslims as much as it was about strengthening our relationships with allies in the Middle East. Shannon?
All right, Garrett Tenney, thank you very much. So, as Garrett pointed out, the left is deriding the president's iftar dinner tonight as a false charade. So, let's talk to retired Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, see what he thinks. He's a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and the Vice President of the Family Research Council. General, great to have you with us tonight.
Good to be with you, Shannon.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the president actually noted tonight during his remarks that first foreign trip last year and how he wanted to build bonds with these important countries. He talked about it again tonight and said over the last year that those bonds have really strengthened, those friendships have grown, and he's glad to see the progress.
Yeah, keep in mind that he also stood before those Muslim leaders and said, drive them out, talking about the radical Islamic terrorists that were residing in their countries, that were training and operating in their countries. He said, drive them out. What most people don't realize is that's a Quranic term that was used when they conquered the southern littorals of Europe or the northern littorals of Africa. They were supposed to drive them out. So he went there with a very deliberate message for them, drive them out. But he didn't do anything there to indicate to them that he did not want to have a relationship with our allies in the Middle East, and we do have allies. I think this iftar dinner is the right thing because we all believe in religious liberty. And Muslims should be able to worship, so long as they don't, that religion or the practice of their faith doesn't infringe on our Constitution or the rights of others. So I think he's done very well here.
He's tried to make the distinction, but at times you saw the old clips from the campaign trail. People have been very offended by the way that he's talked about some of his concerns and maybe was not very articulate with that. One activist tonight tweeted this: he's hosting this iftar as a defense, so when we call him out for Islamophobia, he can quip back with, I love the Muslims, I had them over for dinner. His pundits will echo that defense, asserting that because he engaged with us once, that's enough proof he isn't an Islamophobe.
Yeah, look, President Trump is speaking different than candidate Trump. I mean, reality has set in. He sees things from a different perspective now, and I think he's modified his tone a bit, but he's also come to grips with reality. And, you know, the largest Muslim populations are in Indonesia, Pakistan, and India. None of them are on this travel ban, as it is frequently called. So if he was really discriminating against Muslims, as he's accused of, then he would have put those three countries on there. And in fact, North Korea and Venezuela are on there, but they're not Muslim countries. So he's getting a bad rap on a lot of this, but he has modified his tone.
He has. And of course, we're waiting now from the Supreme Court for their decision on Travel Ban 3.0. And a lot of the conversation there was whether or not the justices should consider these things he set out on the campaign trail or just the text itself of the travel ban, which is much different than people would want to characterize it as. In the meantime, you know, he's gotten heat for retweeting controversial things from groups that are considered anti-Muslim overseas. But it sounds like much of what he was doing tonight was a message to folks overseas, more than it was in these groups that held the protest iftar outside the White House tonight, saying some of them they weren't invited, and others saying even if we were, we want nothing to do with this. Any legitimate, they said, Muslim group wouldn't want anything to do with this. But do you think it's a mission accomplished for him if what he was trying to do is speak to the international community with this dinner?
Well, I do. And again, I think he realizes the importance of us having relationships with allies in the Middle East and allies in the Muslim world. That said, it is really, you didn't say who the protesters were, but it was led by CARE.
Yeah, they're one of the groups.
The leading organization in America that supposedly represents Muslims. I don't think they represent but a very small percentage of the Muslims in this country, because the majority of the Muslims in this country want nothing to do with jihad, violent jihad, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And as we saw in the Holy Land Foundation trial in Dallas in 2008, CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator in a trial that convicted 5 defendants on 108 counts of raising money in America to support terrorism. And CARE was an unindicted co-conspirator. The Holder DOJ would not prosecute them. But that means that they are a front, established in federal court. They are a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. I think it's good that they were not invited, but more importantly, I think it's laughable that they're out there protesting now, because they have the freedom to continue operating in this country.
Well, as you said, this is a country that recognizes freedom of religion for all, or freedom from religion if folks don't want to practice anything at all. It is one of the beautiful, most sacred freedoms that we have. And so a lot happening inside and outside the White House tonight. General Boykin, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Shannon.
All right, best news ever. Well, that's what Kim Kardashian said about President Trump's latest pardon. Now the floodgates are opening, and lobbying for a presidential pardon, well, it's becoming quite popular. Trace Gallagher tracks who could be next and why Kim got the good news tonight. And there she was, right next to her husband, the president, today at the FEMA briefing. Howie Kurtz investigates the media's claims about the First Lady and all those conspiracy theories about Melania. President Trump has commuted the sentence of Alice Marie Johnson, who was put on the president's radar by reality TV star Kim Kardashian. Trace Gallagher joins us now to tell us more about Johnson and her crime. What do we know, Trace?
Hi, Shannon. After serving almost 22 years, Alice Marie Johnson, who's now a great-grandmother, walked out of a Pickens County, Alabama prison today. Johnson was greeted by her family and supporters and said she feels like she was resurrected from the dead and has her life back. Listen.
I'm feeling no handcuffs, nothing on me. I'm free to hug my family. Yes. I'm free to live life. I'm free to start over. I cannot. This is the greatest day of my life.
Johnson was convicted in 1996 of drug conspiracy and money laundering for her involvement in a Tennessee-based cocaine trafficking operation. The 63-year-old still claims she didn't sell drugs or make deals, but she has acknowledged wrongdoing. Appellate judges and the Supreme Court all rejected her appeals, and former President Obama said no to her request for clemency. But her supporters, including reality star Kim Kardashian West, continued pushing for her release. And last week, Kardashian West met with President Trump at the White House, asking him to grant clemency. Here's Kardashian right after that Oval Office meeting. Watch.
She's done her time. I mean, she's done almost 22 years. You know, I think in life, everyone makes mistakes, and she really deserves a second chance.
Kim Kardashian West today thanked the president for the commutation, and Alice Johnson thanked both Kardashian and the president. The White House released a statement that reads in part, quoting, "While this administration will always be very tough on crime, it believes that those who have paid their debt to society and worked hard to better themselves while in prison deserve a second chance." Alice Johnson is the 7th pardon or commutation granted by President Trump so far in his 16 months, including the posthumous pardon of the first black heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson, conservative commentator Dinesh D'Souza, who pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations, and former Bush administration official Scooter Libby, convicted in the 2003 leak that revealed the identity of CIA operative Valerie Plame. President Trump says he is also considering pardoning Martha Stewart and former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who is not eligible for parole until 2024. And as you might imagine, experts say we can expect to see an uptick of celebrities and others pushing the president to free their favorite felons. Shannon.
Stay out of trouble, Trace. We won't have to go back to
Will do.
Okay. Thank you, Trace. All right, immediate frenzy erupting over First Lady Melania Trump. Some reports suggested she was missing in action. Well, today the president lashed out on Twitter, calling the coverage unfair and vicious. Fox News Channel Media Buzz host Howard Kurtz separates fact from fiction.
She went through a little rough patch, but she's doing great, and we're very proud of her. She's done a fantastic job as First Lady. The people love you. People of our country love you. So thank you, honey.
Melania Trump appeared at a FEMA hurricane briefing with her husband today, which would have been unremarkable, except much of the media had turned her absence from the public stage into a melodrama. Once the First Lady began staying away from the cameras after her kidney surgery 3 weeks ago, the media drumbeat kept growing louder. Politico ran a story titled "White House Silence on Melania Stokes Conspiracy Theories," and it named a few, such as that she's secretly cooperating with Robert Mueller. NBC had a piece on why Melania's vanishing act matters. One reason, the significance of the First Lady to the president's state of mind. And there was this from the Huffington Post. Melania mystery continues. First Lady won't accompany president to G7 or Singapore.
Melania's long absence from the public eye has everyone wondering what is really going on. On social media, jokesters put her image on milk cartons.
I don't think it's just the press who are rabid, to be fair. I think they're Democrats, Republicans, fans. There are lots of people just wondering, where is the First Lady of the United States?
That kind of coverage prompted the president to unload on Twitter today. The fake news media has been so unfair and vicious to my wife and our great First Lady, Melania. During her recovery from surgery, they reported everything from near death to facelift to left the White House and me for New York or Virginia to abuse. All fake. She's doing really well. The president added that 4 reporters had spotted the First Lady walking to a meeting, but they never reported the sighting because it would hurt the sick narrative that she was living in a different part of the world, was really ill, or whatever. The First Lady wasn't literally missing, as the East Wing made clear that she was attending meetings. Melania herself tweeted the media, "We're working overtime speculating where I am and what I'm doing." Journalists weren't vicious toward Melania Trump, as the president claims, but grew obsessed with her staying behind the scenes, knowing full well this is a First Lady who doesn't relish the spotlight. But spreading unsubstantiated conspiracy theories has no place in the news business. Shannon?
Right you are. Howie Kurtz, thank you. A group of Republican lawmakers outraged, claiming a prominent U.S. environmental group is colluding with China and trying to disrupt the U.S. military. And it's President Trump facing off against Senator Bob Corker over trade tariffs. Is Congress trying to resist the president on tariffs, North Korea, and more? Stick around for the debate. House Republicans making some extraordinary claims about the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the biggest green organizations in the country. The lawmakers claim the NRDC enjoys so cozy a relationship with Beijing's communist government that it often turns a blind eye to Chinese environmental threats. Those include overfishing and the ecological devastation of China's military buildup in the South China Sea. They also point out the NRDC attempts to curb U.S. naval exercises in the Pacific through lawsuits. The lawmakers say the NRDC, quote, appears to practice self-censorship, issue selection bias, and generally refrain from criticizing Chinese officials when dealing with environmental issues. They also write this: the group appears to take an adversarial approach, not with China, but to the U.S. Well, tomorrow, nearly 200 Democratic lawmakers get their first chance in a federal court to argue that President Trump is violating the Constitution by accepting foreign state favors and not seeking congressional approval first. The case alleges President Trump is violating the Emoluments Clause. Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal is the lead plaintiff, and he reportedly listed trademarks with China as a recent concern. Well, Senator Bob Corker standing his ground tonight after a reportedly heated call this morning with the president, where they discussed his bill to rein in the chief executive's authority on trade and tariffs. Senator Lindsey Graham issuing a statement in support of the president. Now Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is coming down on the side of the White House.
Yeah, I don't think we need to be trying to rein in the president through legislation. Number one, it'd be an exercise in futility because he wouldn't sign it.
And not surprising, the Democrats are also looking to clip the president's foreign policy wings as well. Joining us now, Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall and radio host on WMAL in Washington, Larry O'Connor. Larry and Leslie.
Hi, Shannon.
Thank you for joining us. Good to see you tonight. All right, let me play a little bit of what Senator Corker had to say, because there's kind of this conversation on the Hill. Do you go after the president and his moves on trade through legislation, as Corker's trying to do, or have private meetings, which is more what Senator Perdue has been trying to do? Here's what Corker says.
What's happening is unfair to our country, and instead you can just drive a freight train through it. And so because they're utilizing it in this unprecedented way, what we've asked is, hey, you can continue to do all the things you're doing and negotiate, but once you complete the work, you have to submit it to us for approval, because tariffs and revenues are the responsibilities of Congress, not the executive branch.
But Leslie, the president's been making some very bold moves with regard to these tariffs on a number of fronts the last few months.
I don't have a problem with Congress wanting to have their eyes on and approval, thumbs up or down, with what happens not only with tariffs but even with North Korea. But Corker's legislation and the timing of this, Shannon, is a big problem for me, even as a Democrat. I support having tariffs, and the reason I do is we have had an unprecedented trade deficit for over a decade. He talked tough on China. It was one of the reasons you had blue-collar workers vote for him. And the timing of this is bad because it can really undermine the president's ability and really undermine the leverage that he has going into the G7 summit and even the summit with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And quite frankly, it also lets Russia and China, who really are the big thieves in trade here, if you will, off the hook, and it could send a lot of United Steel workers back to the unemployment line. So I think we need to back the president on this, quite frankly.
Well, there's a lot of discussion about whether there will be those who will join Corker, and there are some publicly doing that. It sounds like it's going to be a tough lift to get this through the Senate, and the president's not going to sign it.
Yeah.
But so there's this discussion in the Washington Post about what Republicans do. It says it's unclear what lawmakers are willing to do besides bark. Challenging Trump comes with its own risks, from alienating his supporters to taking voters' attention off a healthy economy before the midterm elections, which will determine control of the House and Senate. Larry, obviously, Senator Corker's not running again.
No, he's not. And I wish Senator Corker had been this forthright and this aggressive dealing with President Obama on the Iran nuclear deal. Imagine if he had been this vocal and this defiant against that abomination. Instead, he rolled over for him. Listen, I appreciate Leslie and her words. I think she's right. You don't want to listen, I'm not a huge fan of tariffs. I don't want there to be tariffs, but I also recognize that it is a negotiating weapon that the president can use entering into the G7. Let's wait and see what he can accomplish by hanging a tariff threat over their heads. And to suggest that he needs Congress to approve these tariffs. Did you know that in 1971, President Nixon imposed a tariff, 10% across the board, and he cited the Korean War as justification? It had been over for almost 20 years. He has some pretty broad powers here, and he'll be able to do a tariff if he wants. Hope he doesn't, but Corker should sit down and just let these things play out.
Okay, and real quickly, I want to touch on the North Korea summit that's coming up, because Democrats and Republicans alike are saying we hope the president will walk away from things he doesn't think are a good deal. Democrats, a number of the top Senate Democrats, have outlined a letter. They have 5 different goals, and they say this: we believe Congress must act on a check on any agreement that does not live up to these principles. The 5 goals they have: by imposing tougher sanctions and oversight, Democrats will look to the standards outlined in this letter as we examine whether North Korea should be granted sanctions relief. Very quickly to both of you, the Iran deal never went to a vote before the Senate. They didn't treat it like a treaty, and that's why it's easily undone. Very quickly, Leslie, to you first, and then to you, Larry. Should any North Korea deal be treated like a treaty and go to a Senate vote?
Absolutely. And the reason for that is because this is not and should not be a political matter. This is a country where our branches are set up the way they are, with the executive and the judicial and the legislative branch, to have those checks and balances. Right. And so it's necessary. I think it's constitutional, quite frankly.
Leslie, or Larry, very quick.
Yeah,
yes or no?
It depends on what it ends up being, but if it is as broad and sweeping as they're saying, I agree. It should be a treaty. It would be the best thing for the president, by the way.
Lots of love and agreement between Leslie and Larry tonight, and marking it on the calendar.
Big kumbaya
Thank
moment.
you both.
Yes.
All right.
Twice in one night.
I know. Thank you, guys. First, it happened in Cuba. Now it's happening in China. American diplomats hearing strange sounds and developing serious, mysterious ailments. We'll get to the bottom of it next.
We're here to drill down on the facts.
Check him out. Rudy Giuliani spotted at an open-air marketplace in Jerusalem dancing to the major Laser song. Watch out for this. There he is, whipping the napkin over his head. That was after he mentioned to reporters that he thinks special counsel Robert Mueller's team is trying to frame the president. By the way, Rudy, stop by for dance party anytime here at Fox News at Night. It's Fridays at midnight. Time now for Where in the World. 2 more Americans evacuated from the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou as mystery builds over American workers developing ailments after hearing strange sounds in at least 2 apartment complexes. The State Department says the workers developed symptoms consistent with what American personnel in Havana, Cuba have experienced. In a statement this evening, State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said this: as a result of the screening process so far, the department has sent a number of individuals for further evaluation and a comprehensive assessment of their symptoms and findings in the U.S. Well, protests continue for a 7th straight day in Jordan as workers from several of the country's trade unions took part in a 1-day strike to protest a planned tax increase. The country's seen nightly protests, with thousands calling for the government to scrap a tax plan, restore subsidies for bread, lower fuel prices, and to combat corruption. Well, Queen Elizabeth bestowing one of Britain's top honors on Catherine Healy, a former sex worker in New England, for her advocacy on behalf of prostitutes. Healy was instrumental in leading New Zealand to adopt some of the world's most liberal policies towards sex work. She's now a dame in the Queen's honor list. Our Midnight Heroes are next. We'll be right back. An Idaho youth football team's being celebrated for winning a championship and for saving a couple in a car wreck. The Boise Black Knights won the 13 and under championship. On their way home from the game, they saw an overturned car on the road. The team pulled a man out from the car, but a woman was stuck. So check it out. The team worked together to lift the car off the ground. They freed her. The coach, in what we think is an understatement, says these are amazing young men. We agree. Most watched, most trusted, most grateful you spent the evening with us. Good night from Washington. I'm Shannon Bream.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. If you've been paying attention to the news lately, you're probably confused.